Hi, everyone. So we're going to give just a couple of minutes to let people get connected up, and then we'll kick off. All right, let's go and get going. So this is the third webinar in SpecterOps' webinar week. This is Kerberoasting Revisited. Some really quick background in SpecterOps if you're not familiar. We have 3 service lines with adversary simulation, detection, resilience. These are roughly mapped to offense, defense, and Active Directory. Each service line does some operations and training and is represented in this week's webinars, as you can see in the schedule. And this talk is really going to spread across all 3. It was influenced by both operations and training experiences, and it was influenced by offense, defense, and obviously Active Directory, because this is such a commonly used attack technique. And just a little bit of logistics. So I'm going to go through this. I'm aiming for around 25 minutes or so, and then we're going to do hopefully about 5 or 10 minutes for questions at the end, depending on timing. So introduction. My name is Will Schroeder. My handle is Harmjoy on GitHub, Twitter, and all the social media stuff. I'm a technical architect at SpecterOps, been here since the beginning. I've written a lot of code over the past few years. I helped out with a good chunk of the Veil framework, Empire. I was the main author of PowerView and PowerUp. So powerful stuff. I was one of the original authors of Bloodhound, and I'm the main author of the GhostPack C# toolkit as well. So the one tool from there, which is Rubius, we'll be mentioning throughout this presentation. I've talked at a bunch of conferences, DerbyCon, Black Hat, DEF CON, Troopers, all that kind of fun stuff. Written a lot of blog posts over the last few years on a lot of red teaming, PowerShell, and Active Directory type tradecraft. And I'm a veteran Black Hat trainer. I'm currently the course architect for Adversary Tactics Red Team Operations. I was one of the developers for the PowerShell course, which is now open source on the SpecterOps GitHub, so all the labs and material stuff is up there. Been teaching for a long time, and I've been really kind of deep diving into Active Directory and Kerberos for the past several years. So, overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to try to explain exactly how Kerberoasting works. I'm not going to have time to go through how all of Kerberos works in Active Directory, and even if I had a full hour for that, it still wouldn't make complete sense because this is a very deep and complex topic, but I'm going to try to hit the high level and try to start going from high down to some specifics on Kerberoasting, exactly how this kind of component works in the attack cycle. I'm going to deep dive into a particular property in Active Directory for accounts called Msds supported encryption types. I'm going to explain all this and the caveats and how it influences stuff and what it actually means. I'm going to cover previous Kerberoasting approaches outside in, meaning proxying in something like Impacket or using some repurposed protocol suite through interpreter or something like that. Also host-based using some .NET internal stuff, how PowerView did it. Then I'm going to talk about the process I went through to build a better Kerberoasting approach with Rubius, both from an OPSEC perspective and all the different little caveats and things like that. And finally, I'm going to wrap up with some Kerberoasting defenses and also some OPSEC that kind of go along with those defenses, as in how you might try to avoid some of these defensive things that people are looking for. But first, always with Kerberoasting, I have to give a shout out to Tim Medine. So back in 2014, so 6 years ago, he had a presentation called Attacking Kerberos, kicking the guard dog of Hades. This is where he proposed the Kerberoasting attack. It was back at a SANS conference in 2014, and I saw it at DerbyCon. So this technique's been around for a long time, comparatively for the industry. And just really huge thanks to Tim Medine for giving us one of our favorite attack techniques we've had in the past, 5-10 years. So Kerberoasting. I'm going to go over a certain part of the Kerberos protocol of where Kerberoasting fits in. So one thing you can do in Active Directory, we have 3 different parts here. We have a computer that we're attacking, the attacker, and we have our domain controller. One thing that helped me is to think of a computer in Active Directory as a collection of services that are backed by Kerberos. It's not a single monolithic, you're an admin to this. There's a bunch of different services broken out, like CIFS, MS SQL, host RPCSS, all this kind of stuff. We're going to focus on CIFS for this example. Let's say the attacker, or a regular person, doesn't have to be an attacker, does dir computer.domain.com $. What actually happens under the hood is that system will take its ticket granting ticket and present it to the domain controller and says, hey, here's my TGT. I would like a service ticket for the service principal name that corresponds with the action I just performed. So what I mean by that in this case, because I'm trying to access the file system, my computer implicitly will request a service ticket for the CIFS WAC computer name, service principal name, which maps to the file system access. The domain controller will return a service ticket for CIFS, computer.domain.com. And then the attacker, or the regular user, will take this service ticket and they will present it to the actual service itself. That's one way of looking at it, not too complex. We can get a little bit more complicated with some encryption type stuff. So same exact action, dir computer.domain.com $, TGT, goes to DC, says I want a service ticket for this service principal name. The domain controller will then look up which user or computer account has the CIFS computer.domain.com service principal name registered to it. In this case, it's going to be the computer dollar account, the machine account. Then it'll encrypt part of the service ticket with the key, with the account key or hash that had that service principal name registered to it. In this case, that's going to be the hash of the computer dollar machine account. Then the attacker or user will take that service ticket and it'll present it to the target service, which decrypts it with that computer dollar machine account, because it has the same, that's its machine account, it has the same key, and that target service decides whether or not to allow access to that particular user or attacker. So that's the graphical way of kind of looking at it. We're all experts in Kerberos now after 2 minutes, but in general, the reason this happens is because the reason this is architected this way is the target service and the domain controller have to share some key so the service can decrypt the ticket. There has to be a shared key between that machine and the DC for this whole thing to work, which is why the computer's machine account or the user's account, our key, is used to encrypt the service ticket. For most service principal names, this tends to be the computer dollar, machine account key or hash. Computer accounts by default will have randomized long passwords that rotate every 30 days. So you can technically Kerberoast or request, a service ticket that's backed by a machine account, but realistically, you're not gonna be able to do anything with it. But if that service principal name we request is registered for a user account, we now have a piece of data that's encrypted with the key of that user account. So this is all that Kerberoasting is requesting a service ticket that is backed by a user account and then trying to brute force crack that structure offline to recover the user's password. That's Kerberoasting. So let's say you do actually crack this account's password. What can you actually do with this? So if the user account has an SPN registered, the user usually has admin privileges on the machine specified in the SPN. But if not, often they're in privileged domain groups or things like that. But even if they aren't, if you crack that user's key, you can forge service tickets to any user, as any user to the specified service principal name. This is what silver tickets are. You're just forging a service ticket to a particular SPN using that compromised key that backs that service. So for computers, people tend to think of silver tickets as only applying to computers for that machine account hash. But if you Kerberoast a user's account, you can essentially silver ticket to the SPN that user has registered. So a little bit more on Kerberoasting 101, like why we should actually care. Because of this, the way it's architected in Active Directory, any user can request a service ticket for any service principal name. This is by design. This service ticket request gives us a piece of information that's encrypted with the key or hash of the user account that backs that SPN. Also, we only are communicating with the domain controller. We're not sending any packets to that target service, computer, user, or anything else, unless we try to actually use the requested ticket. So if we're just trying to get all these bits of encrypted structures offline to our system to brute force and crack, we're not actually sending packets to anywhere except the domain controller itself. So the TLDR Kerberoasting 101 translation is if a user has a non-null service principal name property, you can request a service ticket and crack their password offline using GPU accelerated software with something like Hashcat. We do this on many engagements. Most red teamers and pen testers tend to do some kind of component of Kerberoasting more often than not in engagements that have any kind of touch on Active Directory. So let's go a little bit deeper. Kerberoasting 201. We're going to get into some of the encryption and key types. So service tickets, just like ticket granting tickets or TGTs, will generally either use AES 256. The full term is CTS HMAC SHA-196. In general, people just call this AES or AES 256 for shorthand, or RC4 HMAC MD5. Shorthand, this is RC4. The key is essentially the same as in TLM. But these two different types of keys tend to be what service tickets and TGTs will use for ticket encryption. AES encryption was introduced with domain functional level, Active Directory domain functional level 2008, but RC4 has been kept for backwards compatibility reasons. This is one of the things that makes Microsoft's job really difficult is the backwards compatibility problem, to where they don't want to break huge amounts of existing deployments, so they're going to keep certain things for backwards compat reasons. From an offensive perspective, we really want responses encrypted with RC4, not AES. It's several orders of magnitude faster to crack RC4 tickets. And up until recently, there wasn't even tooling to crack the AES tickets. But even with that, there's a bunch of weird things that have been coming up. So we just really want RC4 if possible. So because of this, one of the defenses that people tend to try to advocate and have talked about for a few years is something called encryption downgrade. Because modern Active Directory domains, again, functional level 2008 and above, they are supposed to use AES keys by default for Kerberos exchanges. Like TGTs and all this, they're going to use the highest mutually supported encryption type, which is going to be AES 256 for modern operating systems and domains. So people have been saying for a while, like, okay, if you see an RC4 ticket request, this should be a heuristic that an attacker is doing something bad. They're requesting encryption that is lower than the officially supported encryption. So that should be an anomaly. However, built-in request methods for user-backed service principal names nearly always return RC4 encrypted service tickets. So this is weird. And this is one of the quirks that about a year or so ago prompted me to start diving into Kerberoasting a bit deeper and trying to figure out like what's actually going on. So encryption downgrade with air quotes. See this an example. The first ticket is encrypted with AES 256. This is the Kerberoasting TGT service. This is a TGT for Harmjoy. Then I requested a service ticket legitimately, not doing any attacker stuff, for the MS SQL service that's backed by a user account, and I get an RC4 HMAC ticket. So I wasn't doing anything malicious here. I was legitimately using the service. But for some reason, I got RC4 for the service ticket while I had AES for the TGT. So this is one of the reasons, I'm going to explain why this happens, but this is one of the reasons this heuristic has been difficult for companies to use in the field from a defensive standpoint. It's all because of this property called Msds supported encryption types. This is a user and computer account property. It was actually touched on by Jim Shaver and Mitchell Hennigan in the DerbyCon 7 talk, Return from the Underworld. And according to Microsoft's documentation, which Microsoft has extensive documentation on most things. So this is MS 80A2. They say that the key distribution center, KDC, so as a side note, like in the Active Directory world, the KDC is almost always just the domain controller. It uses this information, this property, Msds support encryption types, while generating a service ticket for this account. So, translation, this property on an account with a non-null SPN determines the encryption used for service tickets requested for that particular account's SPN. Going a little bit deeper, according to more Microsoft documentation for MS Kyle, the default value for this field is hex 1C. So this is a binary OR of RC4, AES-128, and AES-256. This is the default value for Windows 7 and up and Server 2008 R2 and up for these operating systems. However, this property is only set by default on computer accounts. It is not set on user or domain trust accounts by default. So if this property isn't defined, or if it's set to 0, MS Kyle says that the default behavior is to use the value of hex 7, which is RC4. So what this means collectively is that computer accounts, service tickets for SPNs that are backed by computer accounts will use AES-256 tickets by default. But for user and trust in a realm like trust stuff, or user-backed SPNs, will use RC4 by default. However, so you're like, okay, I get it. There's a reason why it was engineered like this. You can, though, explicitly set user accounts to support AES-128 and 256 encryption. You can do this through Active Directory users and computers. For example, this is the previous example with that SQL account. I'm going through and I'm saying supports AES-128, 256. This will set the Msds support encryption types to be hex 18, which is AES-128, binary OR AES-256. Great. We would think that with this, that account should only support AES-128 and 256 because that's all it's specified. However, this isn't the case. In this example with that same SQL service, we see that in supported encryption types, it only has AES-128 and 256 supported. But if I manually specify RC4, I can still get an RC4 service ticket. So this is weird. I'm like, so what? Why does it matter? From what we can tell, in most domains, there doesn't seem to be an easy way to disable RC4 HMAC service ticket requests on user accounts. This means that we can't stop RC4 Kerberoasting. And when I originally gave this presentation at DerbyCon last year, I was thinking, LOL, Microsoft, why would you do it this way? And then in the days following, I talked with a few Microsoft engineers, and it makes perfect sense, really, because the reason they do this is in case you had older domains with a backwards, compatibility problem. If there's older domains where user accounts or service accounts had their passwords set when the domain had a 2003 functional level, and then the domain is upgraded, but the account hasn't changed its password since, then it doesn't have AES key material to actually mint these tickets. It only has RC4 material. So there's a reason they did this. You can disable RC4 for the entire domain, but this will also kill RC4 ticket granting tickets, which isn't feasible for 99% of environments because that would break probably like every third-party type thing possible. However, setting this AES support for user accounts at least gives us back the encryption downgrade heuristic. So we do recommend in general, there's no reason to not set this because it's always going to fall back to RC4 if needed. But if you do set this, you can use custom alerting and try to figure out, is someone actually, manually specifying RC4? You don't have to do that type of protection on every account in the entire domain. You can just do in a few pieces of key terrain. So that's Kerberoasting overview, encryption type deep dive. Now I'm going to switch gears into some of the operational Kerberoasting approaches. So there's two main ways that people tend to do Kerberoasting. The first one is what I kind of term external N. So this would be using something like Impacket, using something like Metasploit, either where you're plugged in on the network or you're like proxying in your traffic through an implant. With this approach, because you're not using a domain authenticated user context, you need credentials, like a password or a hash, of an existing domain account to first get a ticket granting ticket so you can then request service tickets. It can sometimes be more difficult over high latency command and control. If you're doing a lot of these complex exchanges and like full traffic, you need to have a fairly interactive tunnel. So say you have like a 1 hour callback interval or something like that, it can, in some cases, be a little bit more difficult. But you can granularly control all aspects of the exchange. You can manually specify RC4, you can change different flags and things like that. The way we've normally done it, just based on how we operate, because we tend to do more of a compromised Windows workstation type approach, is from a domain joined Windows host, we don't need credentials, we only need execution of domain user's context, say from a fish user, so that's great. Is definitely easier over high latency command and control because you're tasking stuff down and pulling stuff back and you're letting Windows internals take care of everything. However, the built-in methods we've traditionally used, which I'll cover in a moment, don't let us control aspects like encryption levels of the exchange. So specifically, what I'm meaning by this is the previous domain join Kerberoasting methods. Most of them, or almost all of them, involved using either setSPN.exe, which is a built-in binary in Windows systems, or .NET's Kerberos request your security token class to request a service ticket for the service principal name you're trying to Kerberoast. These tickets are actually requested and cached on the host, and then they are carved out of memory using Mimikatz. This is the original example done by Tim Medine, or they can be extracted using various .NET methods. So this is what PowerV moved to when Matcha did his whole request that was like Kerberoasting without Mimikatz. So that was a cool step forward in that we didn't need elevated permissions on the host to rip the tickets out of memory. But this has another unintended downside beyond not being able to control the encryption components, and that this will cache a ticket on the requesting machine for every service principal name we roast. So if you've done invoke Kerberoast with PowerView on a host, and say there's 200 different user accounts in a domain that have service principal names, you're going to get 200 service tickets cached in the logon session that host you're requesting from. So that's potentially bad from an OPSEC perspective, depending on what the defensive team is looking for. So again, like I just mentioned, that's a pretty big downside for the number of requests or cached tickets, which can be dozens or hundreds that are pulled down to the attacker host. And as mentioned, .NET's Kerberos request or security token doesn't let you specify encryption levels, meaning RC4 AES, for the ticket request. Because in order to control the encryption types, we need a fully proper ticket granting ticket. We need to implement all the Kerberos exchanges ourselves in a controllable way so we can actually modify all the flags and do what we want. And because we don't have a proper TGT, we can't do this, how Impact and our Metasploit would do. And one of the downsides of this from a user host perspective is that if you aren't elevated, normally the session key for a user's ticket granting ticket is not exportable for non-elevated contexts. So we can't get a usable ticket granting ticket for a regular user until Benjamin Delpy, Gentle Kiwi, figured out how we can do this after all. So this is his TGT delegation trick. He realized, Benjamin, that if we request an outgoing service ticket for an SPN on a server that's unconstrained, so I don't have time to get all the constrained, unconstrained delegation, but just in this case, domain controllers and domains are always unconstrained by default. And if you request a service ticket for an unconstrained server, it's going to return a delegated ticket granting ticket for the current user that will be present in the AP rec that we're actually going to send off, or we're prepping to send off to the DC. And it does this in a way that then we can carve the delegated TGT out of memory. So TLDR, what this means is from a non-elevated user context, we can get a usable TGT that we can use to Kerberoast in subsequent exchanges without touching LSS or carving anything out of memory. So Rubius is a C# tool set that I started building a couple of years ago to port a lot of Benjamin's awesome work from Mimikatz and Kikyo into a C# context. So Rubius implements the structures needed for service ticket requests and responses. It also implements Kikyo's, which is Benjamin Delpy's other tool set. It implements the TGT delegation trick. And combining all this, This allows us to Kerberoast while not needing the current user's key or password and not needing to be in an elevated context, while also avoiding caching service tickets on the attacker-controlled host. And it also lets us specify RC4 in the service ticket request, because altogether with this, we're getting a usable TGT for the current user context, and we're taking that structure and manually requesting all the service tickets we want and extracting the roastable encryption component or structure, encrypted structure out of the responses. So there's a lot of different things in Rubius's like kind of OPSEC for Kerberoasting. This is all on the README, which is about 50 to 60 pages long on the GitHub for Rubius, and I'll have a link on Rubius at the end. The one we're caring about here is with the Kerberoast command. There's a /tgt deleg flag that does the TGT delegation trick to perform the TGS request for RC4 enabled service accounts, roasting accounts with the RC4 hard specified and without using the .NET internal to pull stuff down, which is the default. I'll cover some more of the OPSEC stuff here in just a couple of slides. So in general, I'm going to step back to actual Kerberoasting defenses. One of the common ones is just use long passwords for accounts with SPNs, or use a password vaulting solution to rotate service account passwords. In my opinion, this is still the best solution. It just, people can still request the tickets, but they can't realistically crack them. One of the recommendations used to be check for RC4 encryption and service ticket requests. This isn't really useful based on the stuff we talked about unless the account is explicitly configured for AES. Also, there's some products and services that will try to detect anomalous service ticket requests. So these are people requesting too many service tickets, or they're requesting stuff to services they haven't before. This can be effective, but it's very, very difficult because you need to track the state of all TGT and service ticket requests in an entire domain. This is not a trivial task. There are things like Microsoft's ATA that have started to do some of these things, and other products that do this as well, with varying degrees of success. It is a very hard big data, quote unquote, type processing problem. Another really common one, which I have been burned with before, is the use of a Kerbrosine Honeypot. So this was talked about in 2017 by Sean Metcalf, and essentially means, why don't we create an account with a non-null SPN? The account's not actually used for anything, and then we monitor for any service ticket request to that particular account. So this is a Kerberos domain controller event log for 769. So if you set this up, if someone just Kerberos everything in the entire domain, you can have alerts and alarm bells that go off. Again, we have been caught with this. So once you started thinking about this, I was like, okay, how do we actually operationally Kerberoast in the real world? We don't just, Kerberoast the entire domain all at once, unless that's explicitly what the client wants us to do. What we'll do is we'll plan our attack paths first, and we'll only Kerberoast accounts that are necessary to execute components of that attack path. Because we have seen these types of like canaries or honeypots. And the ways you can try to determine, is this account real or not that I need, is checking the group membership, properties like password last set, account created, things like that in your target before you Kerberoast. There's actually a Kerberoast, there's a /stats command or flag that will actually just do LDAT queries of Rubius and break down encryption types and password last set years for Kerberoastable users, so you can kind of get an idea on what the environment looks like. But taking it one step beyond that, why don't we just Kerberoast accounts that had their password last set prior to Sean's blog post about the honeypot accounts? You can do this after a recent pull request to Rubius, where there's a password last set before and after date that will LDAP filter down accounts that had the PWD last set property between these particular ranges. So this command will only Kerberoast accounts that had their password last set before 2016, and will only return 10 results. So in general, this will help us prevent triggering any Kerberoast honeypot accounts, because we're just roasting accounts that were implemented before the whole idea of Kerberoasting honeypots. So that's pretty much it. If you have questions, please start typing them. Take a second, go through these kind of final bits, and then I'll start reading through some of them. But I'm also on Twitter, on Harmjoy. If you want to play around with this stuff, you can get Rubius and Ghostpack on GitHub. There is extensive documentation for it, like I mentioned. There's also a pretty extensive post that I released early last year called Kerberoasting Revisited, which goes into even more of these components in a lot more depth. So
Hey everyone, we're going to give Will a chance to review the questions that are already in. If you have a question, just make sure to use the Q&A feature so we can keep up with them. It's a little hard to follow them in chat. I also dropped the links to Monday and Tuesday's talk, which are where Richie did a session on hunting from home and Andy did a session on Bloodhound. Reminder, Thursday, Johnny's going to be giving a presentation on dumping LSAS, and then Friday we're wrapping up with some remote project management. So we'll take a minute here, and then we'll start answering some questions.
All right, so one of them is forging tickets to HTTP when the service is running, or when it's running IIS is not possible because IIS validates the pack. Is this correct? I honestly do not know. As far as like for people not aware, pack validation happens when you're the privileged account certificate is part of a TGT that's then passed into the service ticket that's presented to the target. In most cases, at least to computer accounts, the pack which is controlled, it's minted like by the DC. Normally that is not validated. I am just unaware if IS specifically validates it or not. So unfortunately, I'm not quite sure on that one. Let's see, what else do we got? Can we explicitly set AES 120 and 256 for groups of users instead of setting for each account manually? I do not believe that you can do it for groups. It is pretty easy, just if you have a domain administrator kind of context or someone that has the ability to edit a particular user account. This is a pretty easy property to set in mass through just like the Active Directory commandlets. So I think there might be a way to do it with group policy as well. I need to actually try to dive into that and come up with some more practical examples for it. Okay, let's see. Microsoft ATA detects encryption downgrade. So should we be avoiding RC4 HMAC on protected engagements, or should it be blended with other legacy traffic? So this is what we thought for a while, and I haven't gone up against ATA for a bit, but if you're using, this is the trick. So ATA, I believe, will sometimes detect if you're making service ticket requests where you only specify RC4. So something like Impacket or some of the other type of Kerberoasting tools that go kind of outside in will manually specify RC4. The trick is with this is that if you specify that you support RC4 and AES, but you request to an account that a user account that doesn't have the AES support enabled, then it will fall back to RC4, even though you said you did support AES. So there's actually an RC4 OPSEC flag in Rubius that will request all encryption types to user accounts that don't support AES and just skip the ones that do support AES. So this prevents you from triggering that type of heuristic. I believe, again, not 100%, I haven't gone up against ATA recently, but as far as I understand everything, I believe as long as you're careful about it, there is still a way to get around that. Let's see. Can you talk more about the default downgrading to RC4 ticket? So in general, that particular property, the Msds supported encryption type, that's what affects what type of encryption is used for that account when service tickets are requested for SPNs registered to that account. And the way it's set up is by default, if that property isn't set to anything, then Active Directory will use RC4 always as like a fallback. If you do set that property to say, I support only AES, Active Directory will still fall back to RC4 as like a fail-safe default, as far as I know. So that's essentially, it's always going to use RC4 for user counts unless you manually specify it to say use AES. If you do specify it, again, if you do say this account only supports AES, then you at least get that nice heuristic from the Active Directory, like Kerberos event log standpoint of saying like, okay, someone is manually requesting RC4 in this case. Someone said, what about AES rep roasting attacks? Those are conceptually a little bit similar. These are roasting accounts that don't have Kerberos pre-authentication enabled. It's technically a completely separate technique or attack versus Kerberoasting. but conceptually kind of is a similar type thing where you're requesting part of a ticket response that you can crack offline. It's just doing it for accounts that don't have Kerberos pre-authentication enabled, which isn't as common across a lot of environments. The nice thing about Kerberoasting with this approach is that it's for any user account that has a non-null service principal name, which is much more common than having Kerberos pre-authentication disabled. Let's see. Oh, it's a bunch. Let's see. I can probably answer a few more. Let me. Just I'm going to look for. Look through just a couple more. Someone said, as far as like RC4, like downgrades and stuff like that is in the Windows event logs. If you enable Kerberos event logging on the domain controller, it is event log, I believe, 4769. If you search Kerbrosine Honeypot by Sean Metcalf, he has a really nice way of detailing how you implement these Kerberos Honeypot type accounts, as well as the specific Kerberos event logs and everything on the domain controller side that you can use to detect those. Let's see. Someone asked if it only supports AES, can we request it safely without alerts using what mode? Also, the ticket can be correct hashcat or John the Ripper. I believe John the Ripper Magnum does support all these different types. We tend to use personally, just personal preference, we tend to use hashcat with the GPU accelerated brig, which has that RC4 HMAC for the Kerberos request implemented in. I believe there's also an AES module. I forget if it's landed in the master yet. And again, like I mentioned before, if it says it only supports AES, you can still request RC4 and you'll get an RC4 ticket back, but you open yourself up to the possibility of you might be triggering an encryption downgrade heuristic from the defensive team if they are looking for that. Let's see. So I can answer that guy. Okay. Someone asked, Rubius doesn't make use of setSPN, right? Many EDRs just flag setSPN for triggering an alert. Rubius does not use setSPN.exe. It uses no external binaries. It has it uses an ASM1 library to actually build all the Kerberos requests and responses and like response parsers and stuff on the back end. So no additional processes are created. And if you're doing the TGT delegation type approach, there's no, like the tickets aren't actually requested through LSAS. And pretty much the main indicator from that standpoint would be a process that's not LSAS communicating over port 88 outbound to domain controller for Kerberos stuff. Because just like with anything, there's always a trade-off. There's no perfect approach for anything. So Rubius has its own specific indicators, but it at least doesn't, flag or doesn't, trigger setSPN.exe or anything like that. Someone said, is it possible to use Rubius on a non-domain join machine using run as? Are there any downsides compared to a domain join machine? It should be possible to use it from a non-domain join system. Also, if you just specify the DCs and you have, like the key, or the password for a particular user account that you're using to get the TGTs in the first place, you can use any TGT with a Kerberosing module itself. I just don't have a lot of experience doing that because most of our engagements tend to happen from a user authenticated type phish context. Someone said, can you use the TGT delegation trick to get the current user's TGT to then import somewhere else to impersonate that user from another host? Yes, as far as I know, there are a few restrictions on what you can do with a delegated TGT versus a primary TGT. One specific one I know of is you can't do the Kerberos password reset to force reset the person's password unless you have a primary TGT. There might be other restrictions I'm just not entirely positive on. But in general, that delegated TGT is effectively going to be the same as if you were harvesting someone's creds from an unconstrained delegation server. So you should be able to access most things or most services in the environment, as far as I know. Let's see. Someone said, can you request an AES ticket without triggering any alert? As far as I know, yes. You're just going to have, it's going to be like 2 to 3 orders of magnitude slower to actually try to crack the password offline. Yeah, someone else had asked that with the AES stuff. That was what, it's possible. It's just operationally from an offensive standpoint, it's not quite as nice for us. I mentioned, any more defensive components and what you should look for. In general, my defensive advice tends to be from a preventative standpoint of, any user account that has a service principal name, have, set a really long password or use a vaulting solution. That's preventative. From a detective standpoint, enable AES support, only AES support for the Msds support encryption types for any user accounts that have non-null SPNs, and then check for that encryption downgrade on the Kerberos standpoint. Also, from like the Rubius specific host-based defensive standpoint, you can look for any process that's not lsas.exe communicating over port 88, which is what Rubius does for all the Kerberos exchanges. There is a potential for definitely some false positives and like any third-party software, weird things that implement their own Kerberos stack. And that's at least potential approach as well. If you have some homegrown stuff, you might be able, if you have like proper event logging and some nice SIM or something like that, you might be able to do some like number of ticket anomaly based detection of like, is someone requesting 100 service tickets at once? That's just a little bit more difficult, like I mentioned, but you might be able to rig up some Kerberos alerting for that. Let's see. All right, and I think that's about as much time as we have. Really appreciate everyone taking some time out of their day. I know things are a bit crazy right now, but really appreciate everybody tuning in. And be sure to check out Johnny's webinar tomorrow on some capability abstraction for LSAS. He's going to touch on some really cool stuff that'll have a little bit of interplay with some of like Kerberos and credentials and all those types of things as well. So thank you guys very much.